I am Dr. Benjamin Franklin, and I spent the years from 1776 to 1785, nearly 10 years, living in France, specifically in the village of Passy, just to the west of Paris, between the walls of the city and the Bois de Boulogne. I was serving as the representative of the United States of America before the court of France. And in the year 1783, I was witness to one of the most remarkable events in the history of the world. And that is what I wish to tell you about today. Now, as it is a long tale, and I have promised to be less verbose than I sometimes am, I must attend strictly to the tale. If any of you have questions or curiosities about the story I tell or anything else, you are welcome to write to me, and I will answer them those questions as swiftly as I might after I am done with this discourse. But I shall not interrupt it for that purpose. Now, the matter that I wish to tell you of first came to my attention in July of that year, when I made the acquaintance of a Monsieur Montgolfier, Etienne Montgolfier, or Stephen Montgolfier, as we might say. And Monsieur Montgolfier had come to Paris with the intent of flying. Yes, flying through the air. And it came about in this way. His brother Joseph had noted one day a sheet hung over a fire to dry. And the smoke from the fire lifted the sheet up, though even when it was wet, lifted the sheet up. And he could not help but think, if a fire may lift a sheet, may it not lift a man? And he began to think about how that might be done. In November of 1782, Joseph Montgolfier built a little box, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. He set it on some bricks, covered it. It was made of thin layers of wood and then covered with taffeta, open at the bottom. And beneath the open bottom of the box, he built a fire of watered up paper and straw. And when the smoke billowed out from underneath his box, he let it go. And lo and behold, it flew right up to the ceiling of the room he was in and stayed there against the ceiling for some few minutes. Well, then he told his brother Etienne about the matter, and they set about to build a much larger box. This one was 9 foot square. And in December of 82, they performed the same experiment out of doors using their much larger box. And this one, it also sailed to a great height. It stayed aloft for 10 minutes, and it came to Earth more than a mile from the place where they had sent it up. They were delighted and astonished, and set about, the two of them, determined to do this on a much grander scale too, to make a machine capable of lifting a man off the ground. And so they did. They spent the next 6 months preparing their next experiment. This one they did not make in the form of a box. They made it in the form of a globe, of strips of cloth buttoned together. 1,800 buttons they used. The whole thing weighed 500 pounds. Now, how can one possibly expect to lift a 500-pound sack off the ground? Well, they did it. In Annonay, in the southern part of France, where they lived, with a great company attending to watch them succeed or fail. They built a great fire, set their gigantical sphere of cloth over it, and allowed the smoke to fill it and distend it. And when it was all puffed out to its largest extent, they released it. Now, they had made preparations to chart its course and to observe it from various places. They determined that that globe of cloth lined with paper and filled with smoke rose 1 mile into the air a mile, came to Earth more than a mile away. It was a remarkable accomplishment and astonished all who saw it. And that is when it was determined that Etienne must come to Paris and do the same there, and do it even better. He had enlisted the assistance of Jean-Baptiste Ravillon, who was a wallpaper maker, and together they were working upon an immense sort of balloon. The one they flew in June of the year before was 30 feet high. This one was to be 50 feet high, 50 feet in circumference, an immense thing. Again, made of taffeta, lined with paper, open at the bottom so that the heated air could be sent up into it. Now, while they were at work preparing their grand experiment, another gentleman learned of it, a Monsieur Jacques Charles, or James Charles, as we might say in English. And Monsieur Charles, he was a bit of a chemist. And he said, well, that's all very good and well, but I know a better way. He had been experimenting with various sorts of airs, and he knew that if oil of vitriol, or what is sometimes called sulfuric acid, is poured over iron, pieces of bits, preferably iron filings or any little bits of iron, it generates a peculiar sort of air that has been called inflammable air, because it will burn by itself. It does not require any other fuel. But this inflammable air, it has another name. The French have dubbed it hydrogène, or we might say in English, hydrogen. I won't go into the origin of that, but this hydrogen gas is much lighter than common air, even at ordinary temperatures. It is much lighter, in fact, than even very hot air or smoke. So if this inflammable air or hydrogen could be generated in sufficient quantity to fill a large globe, why, it might be a far more effectual means of enabling flight than the Montgolfier's hot air balloon. And so Monsieur Charles and a pair of young engineers, the Roberts, set to work to make a balloon of their own. Now, the great question in July and August as to which balloon would be ready first, and which would be the first to make an actual ascent with their balloon in the city. As it happened, well, for all the difficulty and expense of making all the inflammable air, and that was the biggest part of it, the fact that Monsieur Charles' balloon was so much smaller no doubt helped, so that he was ready first. And so the first balloon, the first aerostatical machine, as they were called also, to go up in Paris was sent up from the field of Mars, the Champs de Mars, on the 27th of August, 1783. Now, I was very fortunate. My house at Passy sits on a rise, looking down over the Seine, looking down over the field of Mars, so that I could sit on my own terrace and enjoy a fine view, a fine prospect of this first balloon being sent up. It was only a mile away. And so, in fact, a large concourse of people gathered on my terrace to watch this thing on that day. And there was a great deal of cheering and clapping when they saw this thing, this man-made object soaring through the air above the field of Mars. Now, there was one old curmudgeonly fellow standing not far from me, and he said, well, that's a pretty little toy, very expensive from all I've heard, but for all that money, what earthly use is it? I could not but remark to him that, Monsieur, of what earthly use is a newborn infant? That's what it was. And who knows where it might in time lead mankind. Now, of course, the Montgolfier balloon was not yet ready, and the company was very distressed that Monsieur Charles' balloon had gone up first, but they ought not to have been concerned with it because, frankly, it drew so much attention to balloons in general that I dare swear that the Montgolfier's efforts were far more closely attended to and watched precisely because of the contest between the two balloon makers. On the 3rd of September, a week after the Charles balloon, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war between France and Holland and Spain and America, acknowledging for the first time generally the independency of the American states and returning the world to peace. A great event indeed. And I don't think the people of Paris paid the least attention to it because they were all wrapped up in talking about balloons instead. Well, perhaps they were right as to the relative importance of the two. A week after the treaty was signed, Monsieur Montgolfier was ready to test his balloon, which he did on a tether. It seemed to work very well. And a week after that, I think about the 18th of September, I don't remember the date for sure, they determined to launch their new balloon, which much larger than anything they'd been built. This one stood 60 feet high. It had a gallery around the base for passengers, it was open at the bottom. And this, they were certain, was large enough to support men in flight. Of course, no one knew if a man could survive such a thing. I mean, what if something happened? What if the balloon burst? What if it tore? What if rising so rapidly to such a great height was damaging to the human frame or nature? No one knew. Now, His Majesty, King Louis, was very interested in all these proceedings. He and his wife both had become very much enamored of balloons, and he graciously offered to Monsieur Montgolfier a pair of condemned criminals to make the first flight, figuring that if they died, then no one had lost anything. But Montgolfier thought that no, he would not even risk a condemned man's life in his machine. They would begin with some beasts, the animals. And so the first flight carried 3. A sheep, which was considered to be most like a human being in its anatomical form, and tissues and so on, so that if a sheep could survive it, then certainly a man could. And then they put in 2 birds, a bird that was accustomed to flying and even flying at great heights, a duck, and also a bird that never flew at all, a rooster. Although they named the rooster Climb the Sky, Monte au ciel, I think in French. So when that first balloon was sent up free, it carried a rooster, a duck, and the sheep. I don't know the sheep or the duck's names, if they had any. I only know the rooster's name. But off it went. It was sent up from Versailles. I was not a witness to this because Versailles is a good deal distance from Paris, and with my gout and stone and so on, I find travel on the roads very difficult. So I did not venture to make the journey all the way out to Versailles, although I heard a good deal of it later. The balloon went up. It carried the animals some 1,500 feet into the air. It traveled over about 2 miles and came down after about 10 minutes without any harm to the beasts at all. And with that assurance, although observing that the balloon struggled somewhat even with the weight of the two birds and the sheep, it was thought that this was still not quite large enough to be safely provided for men. So a still larger balloon had to be built, this one to be 75 feet high, gorgeously painted all in blue with a portrait of the king on one side and gilded eagles and flags and festoons and all sorts of ornaments, so that would be a fine and splendid sight. They tested it on a tether in October, Monsieur Montgolfier was the first man to go up in it, 80 feet up in it, for, as I said, that was as long as the rope, the tether would allow it. But he became assured that it would work, that it could safely carry a man or two. A young gentleman, a student of physics, had volunteered to assist, Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, and Monsieur Rosier made the second tethered flight that October. They saw some things that might be improved. There was sufficient learned by those tests that they still determined to make a few other improvements. But at last, the great day arrived. November the 21st, 1783, a date that I am sure will live for centuries in the remembrance of man. Monsieur Rosier was determined to be the first to go up. He was joined by a nobleman, the Marquis d'Arland. The ascension was to be made from the Chateau de la Muette, the palace of the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. Now, this was much to my liking, for the Chateau de la Muette is only a stone's throw from my house at Passy. So it was an easy matter for me to hobble over there and be present at the launching of this balloon carrying men for the first time. It was a blustery morning, and at first the thought was that they would let the balloon go up on a tether first, again, but the wind blew it aside, so that before it had risen any distance, it flew against a row of chestnut trees, pollarded chestnut trees with a great many sort of stiff branches sticking up, and that they caught the basket, they caught the gallery under the balloon, so that the whole thing tilted over on its side. We were all terrified watching. We feared that any moment the fire inside the balloon. Oh, I've forgotten to explain that. You see, this balloon was different from the previous ones in that it was not simply open to be filled with hot air from without. It carried a brazier in the midst of the opening, so that a fire could be kept burning while the balloon flew. Ports existed on the sides of the balloon, so the men in the gallery surrounding it could feed bundles of straw and sticks into the fire to keep it going during the flight. So there was a considerable fire burning in the balloon, and when it heeled over on its side, of course, we feared the whole thing would catch fire. We feared the men would be burnt, they would be tossed out into the tops of the trees and injured, we know not how. Fortunately, the gentlemen attending were able to pull the balloon off the trees and bring it back to its landing, its launching stage. It was much damaged. There was a 6-foot rent in it and so on. So a good deal of time was then spent repairing it. But at last, they were prepared. And this time, the balloon rose, carrying those two gentlemen without any difficulty at all. I estimated it was 250 feet over my head when it passed over top of me. I was able to look up into this interior of it. I could see the fire burning. I could see the men feeding their hands as they tossed the bundles into it. And it passed over my house, over my terrace, down across the Seine between the École Militaire and Les Invalides, the old soldiers' home. In fact, a fellow made an image of it at the time, and I have it right here. Can I show it to you? Here it is. The inscription on the picture reads, "The view from Mr. Franklin's house." Or Mr. Franklin's terrace, I should say. But there you can see that splendid sight, that immense balloon, 75 feet high. The colorist who worked upon this, I'm afraid, erred somewhat. He makes the smoke coming from the base of the balloon look very much like the clouds surrounding it, and therefore you rather miss the point that that is the smoke of the fire. But there it is. That was drawn. That was published within weeks of the event, for everyone who wanted to have a view of the splendid flight of the balloon. It flew, well, off it went across Paris, and that was the last I saw of it, for I ever saw of it. That evening, the Marquis d'Arland and Monsieur Montgolfier came to my house to tell me more of the sequel of it. It flew in the end for 25 minutes. It traversed 13 miles of ground. Now think about that. 13 miles across the city of Paris in 25 minutes. Try that on a horse. Even on a good road straight out, you're not. It's difficult to cover 13 miles in a half hour, even on the best of horses. I don't know if it's even possible. But they did it in the greatest of ease and comfort. Indeed, Monsieur d'Arland, the Marquis d'Arland, he said that they had fuel enough that they could have continued on for another hour or two. And the only reason they came to ground at last was that, well, they feared the balloon would catch fire. The insides were beginning to char. They could see that there are certain improvements would have to be made to protect against that. They had water and sponges on rods. They could go and try to extinguish anything before it got out of hand. But in the end, they decided discretion was called for. They doused the fire and allowed the balloon to settle to earth after a momentous journey. 13 miles through the air. It is thought they reached a height of some 3,000 of feet above the earth. 3,000 of feet flying through the air. If a man had come to me 6 months earlier, and said to me, Dr. Franklin, very shortly you shall see one of two things. You shall see a pair of witches flying through the air on broomsticks, or you shall see a pair of philosophers flying through the air on a bag of smoke. I would have considered either possibility to be utterly absurd and ridiculous, and to say the least, extremely unlikely. But on that day, the 21st of November, 1783, I saw the latter. I saw two philosophers, and I won't call them anything less than that, flying through the air on a bag of smoke. When I looked upon them going overhead, I could not but be envious. Not that I wished to trade places with them. I understood the great hazardousness of their enterprise. But to look down upon Paris, to see it as no man had ever seen it before in all the history of the world or any other city, to have one's name go down as the first men to fly through the air, I could not but be a bit jealous of that. The French, they cannot so much as open a new bridge or a school without striking a medal in commemoration of the event. And they did so in this case. I have one of them right here. I'll show it to you. Let me see. Can you see it? It shows the balloon with smoke bellowing from it. A figure reclining on the ground, looking up at it in a posture of almost adoration. And the inscription reads, "And the world looked on astonished." And so it did. And so it did. And yet, for all the wonder of that flight, of that excursion. There would be one much greater and much more impressive only 10 days later. But that I shall keep for tomorrow. This is all that I shall tend to now. I don't want to make this over long. If, as I say, you have written any questions or inquiries concerning any of these matters, I will answer your questions as soon as I might in writing. If you wish to return tomorrow and hear another part of this tale, I shall be pleased to have you come and do so. And with that, I shall bid you all a good afternoon and wish you adieu.